Pretty scary stuff from Mother Jones, mate. I've been learning about how the COVID pandemic, guys, operated as kind of a lab for extremist influences. And what's so diabolical is that it's only operated apparently from the mainstream media, from Mother Jones, from our elites. It's only operated as a kind of laboratory for far-right extremists. So the left hasn't tried to weaponize COVID to enact its agenda. The left hasn't tried to weaponize COVID to influence people in the direction of leftism, right? Lawyers, doctors, nurses, scientists, academics, mainstream media, New York Times, NPR, they haven't tried to weaponize COVID to grow their influence, to grow their control, and to reduce the power, influence, and reach of competing sources of information and prestige. No, apparently it's all in one direction. So step back from these petty partisan disputes. Like every profession tries to maximize its power, its prestige, and its money-making opportunities by reducing the power, prestige, and money-making opportunities of competitors. So doctors try to limit the reach and the work opportunities for nurses and for nurse practitioners and doctors' aides and who exactly can prescribe medication, because they want as much power, prestige, and money for themselves. And the media hates people increasingly get their information from dissident and alternative sources like Rumble and dissidents on Twitter and bloggers, right? Mainstream media's attitude towards bloggers has been dominantly negative. Like, who gave these guys licenses to publish information and opinions? They don't have the layers of fact-checking that the LA Times, the New York Times, and NPR have. But you'd be far better informed about what really matters in the world if you read Steve Sailer, right, compared to any one mainstream media source. So Steve Sailer doesn't have an editor, right? He doesn't have all these layers on top of him. He just one bloke, and yet he's consistently wiser, more profound, more accurate, more important than any one mainstream media source. So doctors have tried to limit, who can provide information about COVID. New York Times, Wall Street Journal tried to limit where people get their information about COVID. The American Medical Association wants to limit people's choices where they can get medical care. So it's a Darwinian world out there. All these different groups trying to limit where you can get information, where you can get health care, where you can get sources of healing and wisdom, truth, goodness, righteousness, salvation. Like the Catholic Church proclaims that there's no salvation outside the church. And doctors want to limit your medical care choices so that there's no healthcare salvation outside of doctors. Psychiatrists want to limit your mental health, at least when it comes to prescribing medication. There's no mental health salvation outside of psychiatry. In the mainstream media, from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times to NPR, they want to make sure that there's no information salvation, there's no news salvation, Right? There's no proper understanding of the world around you. There's no way of being a good citizen without accepting the flesh and blood that you're supposed to imbibe with the New York Times and the mainstream media. It's a Darwinian world where different groups are trying to maximize their prestige, their power, and say there's only salvation through us. So Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations, 1776, that seldom do bakers and butchers of the professions get together, right, without making plans to defraud the public, to limit supply, raise prices. And so seldom do professions organize, whether that's psychiatry, medicine, journalism, therapists, chiropractors, right, without trying to limit the sources of salvation that they offer. So yeah, there are a lot of dubious, far-right influences who've used COVID as a laboratory to try to spread their message. There are just as many people on the left who try to do the same thing. So if you want medication, why should you have to get a doctor to prescribe it? Why not allow people access to medication, to buy it from overseas? And I didn't take one position on this. There are good arguments to retaining the current system, but I do reject any sanctification of any one group and its claims to salvation. Like, it doesn't bother me that the church or Orthodox Jews or evangelical Christians claim a monopoly on salvation. I just reject any necessity of according that respect or acquiescence. Like, why do we have to acquiesce to any profession and their claim of exclusive control over the means of salvation? We don't have to buy that. And everyone is better off with abundant forms of competition. Like, medicine is far from a science. Like, I was reading an academic paper about how there are approximately 350 forms of medical consensus over the past couple of decades have been overturned. Like, the medical profession was performing tonsillectomies for decades after it became clear that most of them were at best useless. Be very skeptical of any group, any organization claiming exclusivity to any of the means of salvation, cultural production, wisdom, truth.
Duke's pretty healthy. When is it? Yeah,
it's a big wide world out there. Jump on the information highway.